and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and just want to say welcome back to the show, or for anybody for whom this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. So, for anybody who's viewing this on YouTube, you'll note that there isn't any video content for this one, just a static screen. So, I'm trying something new because we've been doing this podcast for about 5 years, and we do it in a video medium as well as the audio only medium. And I think sometimes maybe audio only is enough. So, this is kind of a test run for that. We'll see in the future. And I'm sure for some episodes, we'll still keep a video recording for it. But, just tooling around, trying different things. But what we're doing today is, sometimes we put the spotlight on a particular person who's working in or around the field of religion and ecology. And sometimes I just do my own thing where I either talk about my work or my perspective on things, or I do a little review of a book. And so in this case, I want to talk about a couple books, which I'll mention in a minute. But first, I want to open with a quotation from the show Seinfeld. If you're familiar with the comedic television series, Seinfeld was a very popular series, arguably one of the most popular comedic television shows in the history of the medium, and about a comedian named Jerry Seinfeld. And so there's this great quote that really underscores what we're talking about today, which is about life and purpose and meaning in the universe. And so there's this thing where Jerry opens his door and encounters his friend George, and Jerry's just ecstatic. And here's what he says. I used to think that the universe is a random, chaotic sequence of meaningless events, but I see now that there is a reason and purpose to all things. And now, the context of that quote doesn't matter. You can look it up yourself if you want and see the context. Of course, Seinfeld is known as a show with a lot of trivialities and things, so it's actually very silly. But that's kind of what we're talking about today, is this difference between seeing the universe as a random, chaotic sequence of meaningless events versus seeing that there is a reason and purpose to all things. And this is mirroring some very important historical developments. If you've studied the scientific revolution, between like the 16th and 18th centuries, there was this emergence of a mechanistic understanding of the universe. So the universe is lifeless, purposeless. It's just a bunch of parts interacting with other parts, billiard balls interacting with other billiard balls. And if it feels like there's a purpose or meaning to things, that's really just something that our human mind is overlaying onto the natural world, and to our own existence as well. But in fact, everything is meaningless, purposeless, lifeless. And once you get into, late 19th century science, and definitely throughout the entire 20th century, and even more so in the 21st century, scientists are saying, whoops, that we were really wrong about that. The more research we're doing, the more it looks like there is an innate tendency toward life, toward meaning, toward purpose, and that maybe the whole universe itself is a living universe, a living cosmology, and that life has a purpose. So, purpose, life, meaning, those things are coming back. They're making a really big comeback. Life and purpose are part of the universe. It's not just something that our human mind is interpreting and projecting onto the universe, onto ourselves. It's really there. So, that brings me to these couple books that I'll be not getting like a full review, but just a little invitation so that for the folks who are interested, you can explore these yourself. The first one is called Towards a Philosophy of Cosmic Life, New Discussions and Interdisciplinary Views, edited by David Bartosh, Attila Grandpierre, and Bei Peng. And this came out in 2023, so relatively recently as things go. And it's a nice collection of essays, partly because it's interdisciplinary, partly because it's also transnational. You have some American perspectives, some European perspectives, some Asian perspectives. So I always appreciate when we get something close to a planetary collaboration, and this book definitely does it. One of the very notable pieces in here is by John Cobb Jr., and a really important process philosopher and theologian, very engaged in the idea of ecological civilization. and born in 1925 and just passed away in December of 2024. And so this is one of his last written pieces, which makes it very poignant. And his basic point is that the universe is a process of life itself, right? That the idea of life doesn't just begin with the first living cell, that to some extent, it's a process that goes to the heart of matter. And for Cobb, as he says in this piece, it's a process that's self-enriching and self-evolving, right? So the fact that there are self-organizing dynamics in the universe, even before the first living cell, if you just look at galaxies or stars, they already have this self-organizing dynamic, right? A cloud of hydrogen atoms by itself becomes a star, right? When the gravitational intensity of a cloud of hydrogen atoms becomes intense enough, the hydrogen atoms collapse in on one another, and when atoms fuse with other atoms, that's called nuclear fusion, and that creates starbirth. And so that's life, and maybe a different kind of life than what we see in biological life with the living cell and etc. But life nonetheless. And for those who don't know Cobb, you have to look up his work. He's just so important for so much ecological and philosophical and theological thinking. And he's very influenced by a person named Alfred North Whitehead, who, of course, has come up on the podcast before. Whitehead was one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, who's undergoing something of a resurgence right now, I think you could say. And of course, Whitehead was one of those people who's like, look, life, purpose, meaning, it's part of the whole universe. And it's weird when scientists try to argue against purpose. There's a pretty well-known quote from Whitehead that goes something like this. Scientists, animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless, constitute an interesting subject for study. Right, because like it is weird, and I've seen this at conferences, and I see this in academic papers where scientists or philosophers or theologians, any number of people, will really intensely argue that there's no purpose to the universe. And you say, why are you so motivated to say that? What is the purpose behind you trying to prove that things are purposeless? And so, of course, for folks like Whitehead and then John Cobb after him, what that is giving lie to is the fact that there is a purpose to things. So even when people try to negate purpose, you can see that there's a purpose to them trying to negate purpose. And what is that purpose? For folks like Whitehead or for Cobb, it's the self-enrichment of things, the intensification of experience, more creativity. The universe is trying to push toward greater forms of creativity, greater forms of complexity, greater forms of consciousness, and there is a direction to evolution. It's not just, as Seinfeld said, a random chaotic sequence of meaningless events. There is a reason and purpose to all things. So, great chapter. And also, got to say, one of the things I appreciate about it is no citations. That's just Cobb speaking from his own perspective, because obviously, in other contexts, you'll see him citing a lot of Whitehead or any number of other philosophers, theologians, scientists. But in this case, he was just speaking from his own perspective. And I always appreciate when people do that. It's easy to get bogged down in citations, which is important in its own way. Not trying to take anything away from that. But it's also nice to see people just speaking from their own perspective and from their own rational arguments and their examples. So, not going to get into all the other chapters, but I will say they explore quite a bit. There's some more stuff from biology, from mathematics, some questions about extraterrestrial life, which is always interesting. Because, of course, if we have trillions of galaxies and every galaxy has hundreds of billions of stars, and of course, our star, the sun, is one of them, it seems like there's a pretty good likelihood that there might be life, biological life, in other solar systems, other galaxies. You also get some systems theory in there, uh, German philosophy, Chinese philosophy, including traditional Chinese medicine, Indian philosophy, like Vedic and Upanishadic perspectives. So, a lot going on there. There's a lot of reasons to like this book. And like I said before, part of it is just that it's very interdisciplinary and transnational. I think we're at a point in the history of humankind where when we talk about things, we need to make sure we're consulting with other cultures, people on other continents, and folks who might know some of the work I've done. Some of the edited volumes I've published have featured people from 6 continents. Haven't gotten anybody from Antarctica yet. But one of the underlying threads of this book is panbiotism, right? Pan meaning all and biotism meaning life, that life is everywhere. That what we call life is not a dynamic restricted to everything that happened after the emergence of the living cell, but is in fact something that is throughout the entire universe and all of evolution. So that's kind of the running thread. So fun book, a little pricey as some academic anthologies tend to be, but check it out from a library. Um, the other book that I want to talk about today is called Cosmic Purpose by Kagawa Toyohiko. And I hadn't heard of him before, which is an embarrassment to me because folks who do this kind of work, looking at how evolution intersects with things like philosophy and theology and other sciences, I mean, that's kind of, that's a big part of what I do. So I was like, how did I miss this guy? So a really interesting character and an evangelical Christian and Japanese philosopher. And his dates are 1888 to 1960, and a pacifist. He's a big advocate for the labor movement, but also was one of these people, like in the early 20th century, who was trying to square this dynamic between what we're learning about evolution at the time, that includes biological evolution as well as cosmological evolution, and what this means for philosophy and religion. And so very similar in a way to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, because Teilhard, like Toyohiko, is a Christian. And so you think, okay, we have this idea of the Christian God, incarnation. How does that square with the idea that life and the universe is evolving? And this also, of course, I mean, other people, Henry Bergson, Alfred North Whitehead, or in Indian philosophy, Sri Aurobindo. All these people were born in the late 1800s. I think Whitehead's probably the earliest in 1861. So he's the old man in the group. But all of them were concerned with this. How do you how do you make sense of the universe on the one hand and of God and spirituality and religion on the other hand? Uh, how do these things how do you thread that needle? And of course, the big thing is to acknowledge that the God or ultimate ground of being or Atman and Brahman or whatever, that's an evolutionary principle, not a static principle. And on the other side, that evolution is not just random accidents, that it does have a direction, that what we call natural selection actually has a purpose or a direction. And so Kagawa gets into that in a very interesting way, including the idea not just that there's a direction of the universe, but that going against that direction is evil. So Kagawa has this very interesting conception of cosmic evil, which I feel like a lot of people are afraid to deal with. A lot of people don't want to lean fully into the idea of evil. Uh, it's kind of like Friedrich Nietzsche's book Beyond Good and Evil. He wants to relativize it and just talk about different kinds of good and bad without actually saying something's evil. It's one thing to say something's bad. Evil is such an intense concept, but Kagawa gets right into that and sees its evolutionary context as well as its Christian context. So really interesting thinker, and it was fun to read this book for that reason, because I'm familiar with folks like Whitehead and Teilhard and Aurobindo, but for some reason hadn't heard of this person before. Even though I know some Japanese philosophers, especially Japanese philosophy from the Kyoto school. So you think of like Nishida Kataro or Nishitani Keiji, some of my favorite philosophers ever, really. And and Toyohiko's in that mix and had an influence on the Kyoto school, I should emphasize. So anyway, does the universe have a goal? And is that goal singular or plural? One of the questions I always think to myself is like, well, is it that the universe has a goal, or is it that everything in the universe has a goal? Because I might have my own personal goal. How does that relate to the goal of the whole universe? And if the universe has a goal, is it okay to sacrifice the interests of individual beings for the sake of the whole? Or for that matter, what do you do when goals conflict? I always think, as you know, people who listen to the podcast know that I have a cat, and sometimes that cat gets fleas, and the fleas have a goal, and my cat has a goal, and those goals are in conflict. And so, how do you deal with those things? And I'm not going to answer that now. Kagawa has his perspective, as does John Cobb, drawing on Whitehead, and these are perennial philosophical problems. So nobody's just going to solve it, but it's a way into thinking about some of the issues that are most important for our time. Like we have to keep in mind the discovery of evolution. You know, you think of Darwin writing in the middle of the 19th century, and you think of cosmological evolution with people like Edwin Hubble, the Big Bang hypothesis. Like these are 20th century discoveries. So we're still trying to work it all out. And we're still dealing with the legacy that teleology is often used for very nefarious purposes. Let's go back to Aristotle. Some people are born for whom their telos, their goal, right? Teleology just means goal, right? Telos is literally the Greek word for goal. The goal of some people is to be a slave. That's your purpose. Your purpose is to be a slave. Or the goal of sexual activity is reproduction, not pleasure, not intimacy, not relational bonding. It's reproduction. And so a lot of what happened in ancient teleology actually enforced racist, classist, sexist kind of hierarchies. So not great, really. And and it opens up the question, is there a way to do teleology that can undo those hierarchies? Or is teleology necessarily going to put some people below other people or some animals below other animals? Does teleology mean that the purpose of the universe is to enhance human experience because we have the most rich and enhanced creative experience? Or does it mean we're on equal grounds with bees and trees and eagles and ospreys? These are tough questions, and that's what these books are really dealing with. So, how do you adjudicate between teleological claims, like the fleas that eat my cat versus the cat that doesn't want the fleas? And are telos claims revisable? Do they change over time? So maybe the telos of certain people in ancient Greece was that some people were slaves and some people were free, but maybe that telos changes. Maybe goals evolve. So tough questions, not trying to answer them, really just trying to invite you to explore these books because I had a lot of fun reading them. In general, this is a thing I've learned in the years that I've been podcasting is don't give away the end of the story. You know, I try not to have spoilers. There's been a couple interviews where I kind of spoiled the book. And like, well, the point is trying to put the spotlight on these books to invite you to explore it for yourself. Because teleology is just one of the most enduring questions in the history of human thought. What is my purpose? And maybe there isn't a purpose. Yeah, I'm not just trying to promote these books for saying that there is a purpose, for saying the universe is alive. You know, who knows? All I know is that there's no idea that isn't dangerous. Even the most emancipatory, liberatory, creative ideas can get reappropriated by people who are using them for evil, for nefarious purposes. And I can go into examples of that, but I'm not. But there's plenty of philosophers who have had brilliant things to say, plenty of religious scriptures who have had amazing things to say. Then somebody uses that for things like fundamentalism or violence or oppression. So it's a mixed bag. And the idea that everything has to have a purpose, sometimes that could feel oppressive to people. Like if your only purpose as a woman is to reproduce, that's an oppressive concept. Not everything has to be put to some use. And on that note, I will say there's a wonderful book by Sarah Ahmed called What's the Use, where she explores kind of the history of the idea that everything has to have a purpose or a use or a meaning, and that sometimes things can be put to alternative uses that they weren't planned for, and that kind of creativity, what she calls queer use, can actually be emancipatory on its own end. I would also refer to Erin Manning. She's a wonderful philosopher who has a book called For a Pragmatics of the Useless. And so that's another person who's advocating for, maybe purpose keeps us locked in stereotypes and in utilitarian thinking. And sometimes it's good pragmatically to break out of that and to find different ways to be useless. Of course, people know that I appreciate Taoist philosophy like Zhuangzi, and Zhuangzi talks about a useless tree. And the thing that kept this oak tree alive was that it was useless to people who wanted to cut it down and use it for lumber. So sometimes being purposeless is good. Sometimes it's terrible, and you're wallowing in a valley of despair because you don't think anything has a purpose. So purpose good, purpose bad, who knows? I certainly have opinions about it, but to me, what's exciting about these couple of books, Towards a Philosophy of Cosmic Life and Cosmic Purpose, is that they get you thinking. And that's, to me, the most important thing. Whether you think the universe has some kind of teleological schema or not, I just want people to keep thinking about these things. But once you think, oh, the universe is, yeah, it's all teleological, here's the purpose. The purpose is creativity. Okay, don't rest on your laurels. Keep thinking. And these are a couple books that really keep us thinking. So, also, I always kind of get confused. I mean, I'm perpetually confused, but especially when there's a binary system. Things are either purposeful or purposeless. That there's either panbiotism, where everything in the universe is alive, or there's something that's not alive and something that is alive. So those dichotomies between life and non-life, between purpose and non-purpose, uh, that always gets me thinking. Is there a way to think beyond the dichotomy? Is there a way to think beyond those dualisms? And of course, people are always trying to propose these things, some non-dual perspective. But even then, I think, well, then we have a dualism between dualism and non-dualism. So that always kind of keeps me thinking, which again is why I say it's not about finding the answer. It's about perpetually engaging in the difficult work of actually thinking. We got to keep thinking. And of course, some people say now is not the time for thinking. With all that's going on in the world, now is the time for action. And I say, well, of course, but we need action guided by good thought. So now, like never before, we need good thinking. So keep thinking, keep reading, keep learning, keep questioning, and that might be our best way through. It's a kind of Zen phrase, right? Sometimes people say, "Don't just sit there, do something." But then the Zen master will tell you, "Don't just do something, sit there." So sit there, read a good book, and I think these are a couple of really good ones. So I hope you check at least some of them out. And in particular, I really got to give a big shout out to John Cobb and all of his work. Check it out if you don't know it. And Kagawa Toyohiko, who was new to me, and I learned a lot. So check these folks out. Keep reading, keep thinking, and I'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care. Be well.